you said making the jump from a filmmaker to book editor. Well, I can tell you that I still actually have a day job, like a lot of filmmakers here in Los Angeles. Um, but the journey, I guess, for those of you, I guess if you have not had a chance to read the book, or if you haven't seen the book yet, I can kind of give you a short history of how I got into the project, if that makes sense. And I guess that'll explain your answer your question, hopefully, Alberto. So again, I consider myself a filmmaker. I've been out here in LA 20 years chasing the dream. And obviously there's lots of types of movies, lots of genres of film. And about, I say it's 2022 now, probably like 6 or 7 years ago, around 2015, I started to watch a lot of blaxploitation movies. For those of you who may or may not know what those are. And blaxploitation films, that's a title that was attributed to them. And they started around the whole genre of filmmaking started around 1970. You say basically the entire decade of the 70s for existed for blaxploitation films. They started to kind of wane or give out, maybe in the late 70s. But some people say if you take the 70s, that's the blaxploitation era. And that's basically movies that were I guess they were embodied by, they were low budget, unfortunately, but they were being made because prior to then, there was not a large volume of movies starring Black actors being made. So they had primarily Black cast, largely Black cast, largely low budget, and they were produced pretty fast as well. And in terms of the themes or narratives, a lot of times they were set in the ghetto or in the hood, as you might say today. And it typically involved movies about Black empowerment, by and large, in broad strokes. Basically, people being tired of taken advantage of by the system at large. So, and the nickname was given blaxploitation because there were some critics who felt that these films actually exploited Black actors or Black people, or the Black predicament in America at the time of basically being poor in Black America. So they called them blaxploitation movies. That they just kind of stuck. So. That's a little framework there. So I started to watch these blaxploitation movies about 6, 7 years ago. I knew about a lot of them, and there were dozens of them. You can go online and search. And I knew about a lot of them. I had seen a few, but I was like, as a filmmaker, I need to see more of these movies. So I started watching some, and I came across the movie Friday Foster. And the Friday Foster starred an actress, named Pam Grier. And if you know anything about the blaxploitation era, Pam Grier was huge. She's kind of like the icon of the blaxploitation era. So came across Friday Foster, the movie, and it's tonally very different. Most blaxploitation movies are action movies, by and large. It's still an action movie, Friday Foster, but it also has a little bit of comedy, a little bit of levity in it. So which is different from most of them. Most of them are like straightforward action based. So I started to read about the movie, and then I discovered that it was based on a comic strip, a newspaper comic strip. And I was like, wow, that's kind of rare. So especially I'm like, if there's a Black character in the movie, I'm assuming the comic strip was Black, and it turns out, yes, of course it was. So started reading more about the comic strip, the newspaper comic strip. I fell in love with the artwork. I really enjoyed the stories. So I started to collect the newspaper comic strips, just like, people collect comic books or collect records or whatever. I started to collect the actual newsprint comic strips, and they're very, fairly difficult to find, these originals. Because again, the era started, in the 70s, and actually Friday Foster, the newspaper strip, started in 1970. So started collecting the strips, and I was like, wow, the more I collected them, I was like, I wonder have these things ever been collected into a book form, a la Charlie Brown, the Peanuts, or the Boondocks, or whatever. Do a little research, found out there's no Friday Foster book. And I was like, you know what, man, I'm going to see, this is me talking to myself. I was like, Chris, I'm going to see if I can get these things collected into book form for the first time ever. I was like, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. But I really enjoy so much, I want other people to enjoy just like I do. See if I can get these things collected into a book form. I found out that the publisher or the syndicator of the strip is the Chicago Tribune newspaper. So call around the Tribune. I finally found the guy who's over their intellectual property rights. I was like, hey, you don't know me, but I'm a filmmaker in Los Angeles. Excuse me. I really enjoy your Friday Foster comic strip. I'd love to get this thing printed into a book if possible. And the initial conversation was like, the answer was very short, no. I was like, what? It was like a 30-second conversation. Like, sorry, I understand, I appreciate your love for the comic, but we can't do a book now. I was like, wow. He didn't even explain why. So I was like, okay. I go back to continue collecting the strips. And at the time, I was only collecting the Sunday color strips. And I found out by way of collecting that in the newsprint world, in the comic strip world, typically the Sunday strips are always in color, and then Monday through Saturday are always black and white. Sunday is always larger format, so you get more panels or bigger, more pictures. And the weekday is black and white, and you may get 3 to 4 frames. So you get less artwork in a black and white Monday through Saturday, and you get more in a Sunday color. And I was only collecting the Sunday color strips. So by way of my research, I'm still just collecting more strips, and I come across actually a group of Spaniards, and they're saying, hey, we want to do a book too. We're actually working on a book, and these guys are literally over in Barcelona. I was like, wow, I was like, man, that's crazy. I'm trying to do a book too. So we ended up, exchanging some strips at the front because they were looking for some strips. I was looking for some. And I go about my collecting, and a couple of months later, I think maybe it's like 6 months have passed since I've had my initial conversation with the Chicago Tribune. I hear by way of somebody I'm buying strips from. He was like, wow. And I'm just talking to the guy by way of email. And I told him, hey, I want to do a book on this. And he's like, that's interesting because I know there's this group of Spanish guys doing a book. I was like, what do you mean they're doing a book? He was like, yeah, I just gave them some strips because they're doing the book. I was like, okay. So I called the guy at the Chicago Tribune back. And again, this is like 6 to 8 months later. I'm like, hey man, I hear my cohorts over in Spain are doing a book. And he's like, oh yeah, that's right. I was like, well, and I'm thinking, I didn't say this. I was like, why the hell did you tell me? And he was like, I was like, so are the rights available? He's like, yeah, the rights are available now. I was like, oh, cool, this is good news. He was like, but you got to find a publisher. I was like, cool, I'll call you back when I find a publisher. So I go off to the comic book store and I'm online. I'm researching all the companies that print these types of books. I compile a list, and then I just start literally cold emailing people. Early in my journey, I come across a guy, he's working at a publisher, and he's like, hey, it's like, I like this idea for this Friday Foster book, but I'm telling you, my company will not do it. But as it turns out, I'm about to leave and start my own publishing company, and I'd love to talk to you about it. I was like, cool, dude, let's do it. So long story short, the guy leaves, starts his own company. I connect him with the Chicago Tribune. We all get on the phone, boom, we make the deal. And I believe that was like 2018, I think, when we signed the deal. And the book was initially supposed to come out in June of 2020. But like most things in life, it was coronavirus delayed. And we finally reached publication in December of 2021, last year. So 3 months ago, the book finally came out. So that's kind of the long answer to a short question, Alberto. And interestingly enough, my publisher here in the States, he didn't know the guys that were making the book, but he knew the publisher over in Spain, because these guys travel in small circles, comic book publishers. So, and this guy, he's been working in the industry forever. So he knew the guys over, the publishing company in Spain, a company called Norma, which you're probably familiar with. And as it turns out, we ended up sharing some of the assets from the book. So that's the long answer to a short question.
That's very interesting. I thought that you were making the gesture of reaching out for the book. Let me show the copy. This is a good size book. It's kind of almost like a coffee table size book, right? It's
yes,
and it's amazing because let me show the coloring. I mean, it's a whole process of recovering or repainting, I guess. Going back to, and we can go back to the whole process of editing a book like this, because like you said, you were collecting the Sunday edition strips, right? Because
yes,
the color, but there were always issues. There are always issues with, we're talking about newspaper paper, right? That type of material that ages really fast, that kind of gets, this yellowish tone, and sometimes the color doesn't stay very well. So it has this whole process of, I assume, scanning one by one, removing the color, adding new color. I mean, I cannot even imagine how time consuming that must have been.
Yeah, it's very labor intensive. And it's kind of to your point, I'll show you here. I have a prop for you. So this is my binder. Oh, it's pretty heavy. You can see how thick it is there.
Wow. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is the binder where I actually have, and I started making a little cover for it, but this is the binder where I have the strips. And you can see, and these are all the original newspaper strips. So I'll show you very quickly to kind of add to your point of what the original looks like versus, if I can find one here, what the original looks like versus the scanned version. So kind of have them here. So this is the very first one. I'll hold it up, and it's actually in a plastic cover, so you may lose some of it. Maybe I'll take it out so you can see better. But you can see that it, like I said, it's faded. The coloring is a bit yellow, but this paper was printed in January 1970. So you can see there what an original looks like. And I'll be able to show you, if I can share my screen from the book, that the process, all the strips were what they call remastered. And actually, I give a lot of credit to our guys over in Spain because they did the heavy lifting on this. They did the remastering. But basically what they did was, you're right, they take these originals and they scan them in a computer, obviously, one by one. And then they basically take all the color out and make them black and white. And then they have a color reference from the original, and they go back and recolor them to make them look nice and shiny and pretty and new. So, and I think they had like 1 or 2 guys working on that. So you see, that's a very labor-intensive process. And we have, I believe there's 214 Sunday strips in the book. So you can imagine what it's like to go through and do 214 pages like that. And again, when you do that, you are literally going through and you got to recolor, each and every, if I can show you again, it's back in the cover, but you're doing each and every character, you're doing the background, you're doing the hair. So, it's a lot of work to have to go back and remaster and recolor those strips. But they did an awesome job. I give a big credit to the guys over in Norman.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite impressive. I feel that I need to explain what's my connection to this project as well, because people may think, okay, so why are we, first of all, I love comics. When you were showing that folder, I was getting really, the comic buff in me was like, yeah, I want to see the originals. That's such an important thing, right? So back in, I think it was 2018, a friend of mine and my mentor, Dr. Rosalia Cornejo, she's a professor, a Spanish professor at the University of Ottawa. She was editing a book, or she started editing a book on the cultural connections or cultural relations between African Americans and Spain, like transatlantic connections and how culture has influenced each other. And when she was telling me about this project, at first I was, I wanted to participate and I wanted to collaborate. And first I was thinking about writing something on Chester Himes, this writer of crime novels, who was really, really big in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yes.
He was, I believe he was originally from Ohio, but he had some connections to St. Louis, I believe. And then in the 50s, he moved to France, and then to like other Black writers of the time, they felt that they had more freedom for writing, and and they wanted to experience being outside of the US. So there was a community of writers, of African American writers in Paris, and then he moved to Alicante, to Spain. And from there, he wrote many of his books that were, very popular in Europe and in the US. But I wasn't finding really a lot of material. So then, because, I've been, even though, my training, let's say, like my original training was more Spanish literature, I always had an interest in comic books and graphic fiction. And I wrote some articles about 17th comics in Spain. And then I remember there was this author, this artist, Jordi Longaron from Barcelona, who was like many at the time, we're talking 60s, 70s, he was producing comics or creating comics for international agencies. So he was selling those materials to any kind of, to the British market, to the French market, to the American market. And then he was part of the team who created Friday Foster. And yes. How interesting, this guy who was in Barcelona in the 70s, he was creating this story, this guy who wasn't Black, but he was creating, the style and the portraits and the art of this African American female photographer, Friday Foster, and then so that's how I started, doing research about it. And at the time, like you said, there was no much there was no, the only way to get access to the comics was going to the Chicago Tribune, like the old issues. So I had to go one by one, 1970, okay, January, February, and I had to go one by one. It was such a long process. And then I realized, wait a minute, I can just go to the Sunday edition. So I can save some time, just go to the Sunday edition, which is like a summary. It worked a little better, right? So that's how I started being interested in this story. So, like I said, Jordi Longaron was an artist from Spain. And the writer is Jim Lawrence, who was a white author. And this is a very interesting thing because they were both creating this groundbreaking story of African-American female protagonist at the time when you have, Black exploitation film, when you have civil rights movements, when, it's a hot topic. I mean, it's always been, but I mean, it's even, more at the time, right? That's a very interesting aspect of the story, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely, Alberto. And to kind of give you a little backstory on how Friday Foster was created. So as you said, a guy named Jim Lawrence created Friday Foster, the strip. He was a white guy. He had been working in the newspaper comic strip industry for ages. So he was kind of known within the world of newspaper comic strips. And he had written like some Pulp Fiction novels as well. So he'd been writing, and it's the late 1960s in America, and it's the age of Black power and Black empowerment. And he like, you know what? He goes to the Chicago Tribune and he's like, you know what? I've been writing comics forever. Why are there no comics with a Black lead character, with a main Black character? And the Chicago Tribune says, you know what, Jim? That's a great question. Why don't you go create one? And that's exactly what he did. He turned around and created Friday Foster. So once he had written the stories, he knew he needed an artist. So he goes back to the Tribune and says, hey, I need an artist. And kind of the short version is the Chicago Tribune, being the paper that was a major American newspaper, they have contacts everywhere. They were able to ultimately connect him with Jordi Longaron over in Spain. And again, guys, we all know we live in the age of the internet now, but this is 1970, really like 1969, late 60s, when the process started, because the newspaper strip was first published in January 1970. So the process started late 60s. So Jim Lawrence, once they were ultimately paired up, and for my reading, I found out that Jordi Longaron came to the States one time, and he met Jim Lawrence because they wanted to, before they, want to make sure they were on the same page. Met Jim Lawrence, and they actually went to New York City. Jim Lawrence lived at the time in New Jersey. So they went to New York City and they went to Harlem. And the character, Friday Foster, she lives in Harlem, New York in the story. So they went to New York and they were driving around town just to kind of get a feel for the city. So Jordi could have like that firsthand experience, of actually seeing some real life Black people in Harlem. So they did that, and it was really cool. And from one of these stories I read is that they actually came across a guy who was like, who are these two outsiders, rolling around Harlem taking pictures, because Jordi was taking pictures to have references on the for the character and for the city. And he's like, who are these two outsiders, rolling around? He's like, hey guys, you might want to get out of town before sundown. And that's exactly what they ended up doing. They got a lot of pictures, but sundown, boom, they were gone, because they realized, they didn't know the land that well. But again, that was from my understanding, that was the one time that they got to physically meet up, and that was before the strip actually made it to print. But yeah, I mean, it's a great story. Obviously, Jim Lawrence was a very liberal white guy, even thinking that way at the time. And one bit of trivia about him is that I'm sure everybody here knows about James Bond. James Bond was also a newspaper comic strip, but it was only over in the United Kingdom. It never was released here. They only printed in the UK. And from my reading, I found out that the guy, Jim Lawrence, is actually, they say that he's actually written more James Bond than Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming is the guy who created James Bond. But by way of the newspaper comic strip, it ran for a very long time over in the United Kingdom. And he wrote so much of the comic strip that he's actually written more James Bond than Ian Fleming, who created the character. So that's a little bit of trivia about Jim Lawrence. And he passed away, I believe in like 1993, 1994. But he had a long storied career. He's like what they call a journeyman in the industry. And a journeyman is somebody who's not a superstar, but they've been working in the industry forever. So you kind of create the sports analogy. You guys are in sports. You probably know some players who are not superstars, but they've been playing the game, 10, 12, 15 years, which is a lifetime of professional sports. And that's kind of what Jim Lawrence was in the art industry. in the comic strip industry. You know, known within the industry, you know, not necessarily superstar of his day, but he just worked and worked and worked and worked. But yeah, just the foresight that he had to create this character was awesome. And even in terms of the storylines within Friday Foster, he was a very progressive guy. And I'm sorry, I don't want to get ahead of myself. But yeah, a very progressive guy in the types of storylines that he created for Friday Foster.
Yeah, I mean, going back to, you know, how they met and how they worked together, I think that's such an important, you know, aspect of this story, because like you said, like this was prior to internet, right? And they had to use snail mail. So they were in countries, and they working on a project that was published every day.
Yes.
And, right. I mean, working for a newspaper with, you know, everything needs to be right now, you know, like, and the type of, I don't know, time management skills, I don't know. I mean, like they had to work ahead to have material ready for every day for all those years.
Yeah, and kind of, I'm sorry, to your point, Alberto, I had read that they were actually writing, like Jim Lawrence was writing the scripts. The way the process happened was that, again, this is well before the internet, but, excuse me. So Jim Lawrence would write the scripts. He would write the stories. He would send them to the Chicago Tribune. Again, he lived in New Jersey, so he'd write the scripts, mail them to the Chicago Tribune. They would sign off on those stories and then mail the stories across the Atlantic Ocean to Barcelona so Jordi could illustrate the stories, and he would send back the completed package. So these guys were working literally like 3-4 months out, because again, as you said, Alberto, the newspaper comes out every day and you cannot miss a beat. So they were working well in advance. And again, this was without the benefit of the internet where you just click a button and boom, you send a document. So in the book, we actually have some examples, I think about 3 or 4 examples of some illustrations that didn't make the print run because they were late. And we got the original artwork that was never actually printed in the newspaper. And that's just an example of, you know, there's going to be times when things get messed up, you know, when you're working, you know, via mail, snail mail. So, but yeah, they were, like I said, in terms of time management, they did, you know, they were awesome. Again, to be working internationally that way is amazing, you know, to see that they actually did it for that long, for 4 years.
Exactly. And, you know, since we have some, you know, students, so many students in the audience, you know, and you know, sometimes we have issues with the homework not showing up because, you know, something happens with the emails, you know, things get lost. Like imagine using snail mail for this type of project that had to be, you know, published at a certain time. I mean, it's quite something. The other thing, like you mentioned, is the international connection and the collaboration, because I don't think, you know, we realize at least in my field, you know, in Hispanism, when we talk about, you know, how literature gets translated into English, yeah, literature from other countries, you know, from Latin America, from Spain, gets translated and published in the US. But I think as an international project, comics had always been very internationalized because comic readers are very open-minded. They read, you know, the ones who read manga. You know, like they don't have any biases against, you know, comics produced anywhere else, as long as they, you know, they can understand it get translated. And you know, we're talking the 70s where we have these international connections, even though, you know, the conditions of work were not as easy as they were now. So it's something that sometimes we forget, like those international connections were there, those, you know, that cultural material that was produced internationally that was already there. So that's, you know, that's something that it's very interesting. Something maybe is not super clear for the audience. Who was Friday Foster? What was her profession? What kind of stories she was a protagonist of? Can you tell us a little bit what was kind of the storylines? Or
okay, yeah, for sure. And I'll tell you that, and you know, I'll give a quick pause. I actually I want to guys show you my homemade swag. This is my homemade.
What? It didn't come with the book. It didn't come with the book.
I know. I'm sorry. I'll have to see if I can get some more made. So I just had to show my Friday Foster swag. In the story, she starts as what's called a camera bunny. And again, it's kind of a relic of the times. They don't really do that these days. But back in the days, you would go to a nightclub and this sounds really funny now in the age of cell phone cameras, but they would have these women who are like, you go to a nightclub and you're out with your friends, they would have these women and they would take pictures of you, and you could get a picture of you and your friends at a nightclub. So in the strip, she starts out as what's called a camera bunny. So she goes around the nightclub taking photos of people at the nightclub. That's how her world starts. As the storyline progresses, she actually ends up working for this world-class photographer, a white guy named Sean North in the comic strip. He's a well-known fashion photographer. She ends up working for him as his assistant. And they end up going on like these worldwide travels, solving all these mysteries, having all these these really wild adventures. And she at one point goes from being his camera assistant to being a fashion model, because since she's a camera assistant, to this world famous photographer, he shoots a lot of fashion spreads, and a fashion designer discovers her or takes a liking to her, and he's like, hey, I want you to be my primary model, kind of, I want you to be my, like my Tyra Banks. And so in the story, she becomes like this fashion model for a little while. Then she decides it's not the life for her, and then she goes back to being the camera assistant. But so basically, that's kind of like, those are like the two of the main characters are Sean North, her boss in the story, and there's Friday Foster, and she has a younger brother in the story called Cleve, and you see him every now and then. You may see him maybe like every, I don't know, 3 or 4 months within the world of the story. Those are kind of like the recurring characters that you will always see are Friday, her younger brother, and her boss, Sean North. So yeah, her primary thing is she's a camera assistant to Sean, and they just find themselves in all these kind of just wild, just like crazy adventures. Kind of to my point when I was talking earlier, how Jim Lawrence was very forward thinking. He addressed a lot of issues at the time. So, and some of the stuff still resonates today. Like there's a storyline, and most of the storylines last about 3 months when he writes his script. So it's kind of like, if you're reading a comic, if you guys are any comic book fans out there, you may have a storyline that runs for like 6 to 8 issues, and then a new storyline starts. Within Friday Foster, about every 3 months is a new storyline. One of them that was an issue of the day is that, and it still kind of resonates today, is this is a fashion photographer. He comes across a woman who is a plus size model. And, he thinks it's funny that he actually has to, the magazine gives him this assignment, and he's like, wow, I got to go, photograph these big girls. So he goes on this plus size model shoot, and lo and behold, he ends up falling in love with the plus size model. And the kind of the narrative throughout this particular storyline is the woman, she's very ambitious. She's a model, and she's also a designer. So she designs the clothes that she wears in the story. And she's like, hey, well, why do I have to be a plus size model? Why can't I just be a model? And we fast forward to today, 2022. And again, that's an issue of models. The world of modeling is trying to become a lot more inclusive, as opposed to having plus size models. You got models of all shapes and sizes. So again, Jim Lawrence was addressing these kinds of issues. Again, this is early 1970s, where he's looking at issues of, body shaming, as we would say today. So very forward-thinking guy.
Yeah, I wonder if Jim Lawrence ever found some pushback from the Chicago Tribune about the storylines, because like you said, even though the stories are, the characters are pleasant, is that there's no violence. I mean, sometimes you have some soap opera like sentimental aspect of it, but like you said, like some of the topics were really current, like he talking about Black Power, talking about Asian minorities, talking about indigenous people, talking about feminism.
Yes.
Like so many, and then you will have also stories about mystery, like things like that, more like entertaining. But he was really ahead of his time, and I wonder if, since these comics are always located within a like kind of children area of the newspaper. I mean, you have a mix. Some of them are more adult, but I wonder if they were overlooked sometimes, or I don't know. I mean, I don't know if we have any proof of that, or if the newspapers had some issues with some stories. I don't know if you have heard anything about that.
Not to my knowledge, Alberto. I think the fact that he was so well respected within the industry, like I said, in the industry, he was a known quantity. And I think the fact that he was so well respected and he had written so much, that I don't, to my knowledge, he didn't get any pushback on any issues. I mean, what I think I do recall reading from my research is that one thing they kind of stayed away from was the fact of, you know, Friday being like explicitly being a Black character, in the sense of she never experienced any conflict in those storylines because she was Black. There was conflict, but not because she was Black, if that makes sense. You know, maybe conflict because she was a woman, or, you know, she was in the wrong place, the wrong time kind of deal, but not specifically because she was Black. So that's something they did not address. And again, it's kind of to your point, you know, this is a Sunday paper, you know, being distributed. So these storylines are very G-rated for the most part, if that makes sense. You know, nothing's going to be too graphic, nothing's going to be too explicit. And I get that by way of, hey, this is a, you know, mainstream newspaper publication. So, I will say this though, he did write some novels that were very racy. He has a series of novels called the Dark Angel novels. And those were actually, the covers were also illustrated by Jordi Longaron. And there are 4 of them. And we actually mentioned those in the book too. So he got, those things are like, you know, hard R rated, you know, maybe even pushing X rated. And these are straight up Pulp Fiction of the day. And there's a series of this woman called, her name is Angela Harp, but the name of the book series, Dark Angel series. And I'll see if I can find her. Maybe I can bring up a photo. But yeah, that's where he got into, again, since that was, you know, Pulp Fiction, and he's buying these bookstores, not for necessarily, you know, this is not like a newspaper. Those things are very hard to find these days. They're very expensive, and they are a hard R. Because in the book, she goes, it's kind of crazy. I think she goes from being like a Brown University graduate. She's like a prostitute. I believe she ends up working with the police force. So she has kind of like all these really like extreme scenarios in there. You know, she gets involved with the mob. I mean, there's, in some stories, I think she has like some lesbian encounters. It's like really, you know, hard R Pulp Fiction for the day. Whereas Friday Foster was like the G-rated version. Angela Hart was like the hard R rated version. So he did write the material, but it wasn't, you know, obviously it wasn't coming by way of a newspaper. And I've tried some of those books, and again, they're very difficult to find. And when you do find them, they can be very expensive.
So I guess something like, you know, in between those two extremes is the movie, right? The Friday Foster movie is kind of in between, because you have Friday Foster, who's also has a lot of agency and, you know, power. She's a very independent, you know, woman who, you know, will fight, you know, like she, as you know, in the black exploitation fashion, right? Like that kind of style.
Yeah, for the movie does bear some resemblances to the comic strip. The movie's rated PG. And one cool thing is, in the book, I actually got to meet the director of the movie, a guy named Arthur Marks. And he passed away, I believe, in like 2019, right after I interviewed him. He passed away like a couple of months after I interviewed him. So I was very thankful to be able to sit down with him. But he was up in age. I think he was like in his early 90s or something. But the movie, was PG rated. And the primary similarities between the movie and the comic strip were the main characters. There is, again, there's Sean North. And interestingly enough, since it's a blaxploitation movie, you never see Sean North in the movie. She's at the very beginning, she has a phone conversation with him, and that's it. And after that, it's completely her story. Her younger brother, Cleve, is in the story, and there are a couple of other characters from the strip. In the strip, she meets this Black, really rich guy, like I think he's like a Black multimillionaire named Blake Tarr. He's in the movie. And there's a few other characters. There's a character called Nighthawk, who's like a detective in this comic strip. He's in the movie. But yeah, in the movie, she has a lot more action. I mean, comic strip has action, but there's a lot more action, a lot more fighting, a lot more gunplay. There wasn't a whole lot of gunplay in the strip. There's some, but there's a lot more gunplay. So the movie, sticks to the blaxploitation formula pretty well. But the difference is, again, it throws in some laughs along the way, which I like. And again, Pam Grier stars in the movie. So Pam Grier, if you go and do your blaxploitation research, she's known, probably her bigger movies are like Foxy Brown or Coffee, Sheba Baby. And then there's this one, Friday Foster, which is probably the lesser known of those movies. But again, I like it because it's very different in terms of tone from the other ones. And also another big thing that I love about the movie, it has a lot of Black movie stars of the day. Again, I'm sure it's before your time. It's even kind of before my time. But you know, as a student of film, I know these people. But probably one of the biggest guys that you might know in the movie is Carl Weathers. And if you ever seen the movie Rocky, he was Apollo Creed in Rocky. So he's in the movie, and he plays a bad guy. And another one that's probably pretty big, if you guys have ever heard or seen the show Gilligan's Island, another throwback show from way back when, there was a rich guy on Gilligan's Island, Mr. Howell. The actor's name is Jim Backus. He's in the movie, and it's interesting to see him playing a bad guy. But again, yeah, the movie is definitely, I would say, yeah, squarely in between the Angela Hart books and Friday Foster. You know, a little more action, a little more sexy, and you know, a little more. It's definitely like, you know, a higher rating. I think the movie. I want to say the movie may be rated R. I have to double check on the movie rating.
Yeah, I mean, usually, I mean, I'm a big fan of Black films as well, and you know, Pam Grier is like, you know, the goddess. You know, she was, you know, so iconic, and those movies. They used to, I mean, they used to be more male-centered. I mean, you have females, you know, also who were, you know, like the protagonist, but it has a lot of, they were more physical, and there was more sex, you know, like it was, you know, like you said, low budget, but a lot of ideas. They had a lot of ideas to overcome the, you know, the low budget, right? The limitations of low budget. So it's a very interesting genre. I wanted to mention, because you know, I think it's great that we are able to access these comics again, but this maybe students don't know, but you know, graphic novels is a different, you know, a different subgroup, but comic strips, you know, the ones that were traditionally published either in newspapers or, you know, in small comic books that were not super well edited, you know, maybe they didn't use the best paper. They're hard to find, they're hard to be stored, they are hard to be kept, you know, it's hard to find them, they disappear. There's also an archival issue with comics, because it's a cultural material that is worth reading, that is worth keeping, and in libraries, public libraries or university libraries are trying to collect those materials. But for the longest time, it was something that it was dismissed, right? Like it was a type of material that, you know, there wasn't given much attention, and of course, you know, it's a very delicate material that in some cases got lost. And now we have, you know, in academia, we have more people who are studying these materials, like the way they study film or the way they study literature texts, and it has its own challenges, like I said, you know, finding the material. So having books, these editions is super critical to make, you know, for making our lives easier, you know, when we have to analyze them, right? Or using them in class. I don't know if you ever, I mean, in your experience, you know, in school, or if you have talked to other students, you have talked about, you know, the place that these comics have in culture, like how they need to be kept, how they need to be, you know, recovered. Like, have you, like, did you access, how can I say, like, did you read these comics when you were going to school? Like, did you find them part of the curriculum, or you see like there's an interest now?
Well, for comic books, like a lot of youngsters, when I was a child, I started reading just legitimate comic books, regular comic books, you know, DC, Marvel. Yeah. So that's where I started. I was maybe like 9, 10 years old, and a friend of mine, I was at a summer camp, and another kid gave me an issue of this comic book, The New Teen Titans. And that was like my first exposure to comic books. Fell in love with them. So I went on a run of collecting comic books from, you know, basically like the time I was like 10, pretty much up through high school. And as an adult, I've gotten back into collecting comics as well. Not as much as I did when I was younger, but I'm a lot more selective now. So in terms of the archiving process, even back then when I was a child, I was taught that, hey, they may or may not be worth something, but you always want to bag and board your comic books. So you put them in the plastic bags with the cardboard backing. But yeah, in terms of comic strips, what I have found out, especially by way of Friday Foster, is that you can have an old comic book, let's say a comic book from 1970 versus a newspaper comic strip from 1970. And the comic strip is almost always much more difficult to find than the comic book. But again, thank God for the internet now. Sometimes you may be able to at least get a glimpse, even if you never get the physical newsprint, you may be able to get a glimpse of an old newspaper strip. But you're right, Alberto. In terms of collecting and archiving these things, they are absolutely much more difficult to find, like even digital form. And that's because, as you said, the way of the newspaper, has been going the way of the dodo bird, unfortunately. Yeah. So, newspapers were obviously the main means of communication, 70, 80 years ago, everybody read newspapers, especially pre-television era. But now in the age of the internet, your newspaper is right here on your screen. So, finding these things, again, I've been very fortunate to be able to find the majority of the Friday Fosters. I got lucky. There's a guy, when I started digging, trying to find them, came across a guy on eBay. Again, people collect everything these days. Came across a guy on eBay, and the only thing he sells are newspaper comic strips. Doesn't sell comic books, doesn't sell magazines. He only sells newspaper comic strips. And early in my journey, I stumbled across this guy, and he sold me my first lots of Friday Fosters. It may have been about 30, maybe like 30 or 40 of them. And that was like a real benefit. That's when I knew I had to complete the set, because I was able to get like a pretty large chunk in one buy. I was like, hey, if there's going to be basically a little over 200 of them, and I can get 30 or 40 of them now, that just set me on my journey. But yeah, in terms of finding and archiving, yeah, it's definitely becoming a lost art. And I will say this too, in terms of the original artwork of Jordi Longaron, that's even more difficult to find. Because again, people collect the newspaper comic strips like I have, but there's also the actual artwork that he drew by hand.
Yeah.
I found a couple of auction sites to find them. And we're in March. I think it was maybe like 6 months ago, like the last quarter of last year, maybe around October, right before the book came out. I was on an auction site. They had an original Jordi Longaron, and this is 8.5 by 11, pretty much like the size of a sheet of paper, black and white, because not all of them were colored. A black and white original. I put a bid in of $2,000. Didn't even matter. So his original artwork is highly sought after and highly valued and praised these days. Again, so in terms of the archiving, if you can get an original, that's almost, in the comic book world, that's an amazing feat. Even more difficult than finding just the newsprint stuff. So his artwork is very much so in demand.
I think something that has changed, and we can leave some, just a few minutes, some minutes for a question, is that how the status of the comic artist has changed as well, because now comic artists, they are like artists, so they save those originals, they donate them to a collection, they make sure that they're gonna be appreciated, they're gonna be the right place. While back in the days, like Jordi Longaron, that generation of people who were writing, creating, so much, and they consider themselves like working class artists, in the sense that this is just to that's my way of surviving or pay my bills. So it was a status of a different credit. They were given a different credit. Now, they're considered artists. So maybe there's some questions in the audience. Anybody? They can either write a question in the chat.
Questions, comments, concerns. I'm trying to think what else. He said basically the strip ran for 4 years. It ran from January 70 to February 1974, which is a decent run for a comic strip. And apparently towards the end of the run, from what I read, Jordi Longaron was actually starting to get a little tired of keeping up that pace of that type of work that he had to do on a daily basis. So that was one of the major factors that contributed to the end of it. I think also, from what I've read, the strip was starting to lose maybe some of its distribution, because I've read at its peak, it made about 26 newspapers across America. Chicago Tribune, LA Times, Houston Chronicle, New York Newsday. So it was in major cities coast to coast. But started to lose some of its distributorship, and Longaron was getting tired. And interestingly enough, though, when the strip ends in '74, the movie comes out with Pam Grier and makes sure in 1975. So the life of the Friday Foster was extended a little bit just by way of the movie. And the movie, from what I've read, the movie apparently did pretty well. Again, Pam Grier was a star in the blaxploitation world at that time. So just her, being the lead, being the star of the show, it was able to bring in some audiences from the movie.
Interesting. So questions or comments?
I can also tell you guys, if you guys haven't read, if you haven't seen the book, another interesting fact, I got a guy named Robert Tonner in the book, Tonner. Robert Tonner is this world-class doll maker. He makes dolls out of New York City. Does really high-end dolls. I mean, like dolls are like $300 out the box. He actually did a Friday Foster doll, and I believe it's the only Black doll that he's ever done. He's done some stuff for Harry Potter and some other movies, but he did a Friday Foster doll, I believe, back around 2014. And again, this thing is virtually impossible to find. But I have an interview with him in the book, which is pretty cool, because he talks about how he got into it. And he was like, I have one, but he's like, if you want to find one, you basically have to find another private collector, because they do relatively small runs. It's not like they can produce like 10,000 dolls. They do, anywhere from like to the hundreds or even maybe like low thousands, maybe like 1,000 or something. But the doll, again, he did a great rendition. Friday Foster comes with a bunch of different costumes for the doll. And I was like, dude, I'm not a doll collector, but if I can find one, I'd get one, for my daughter. But again, things, again, it just goes to show you how much life this character has had. That this high-end doll maker makes one, boom, it sells out, and you're lucky if you even see one, in person.
I want to praise also this edition for the amazing extra materials that you have included, with a lot of trivia, from Jim Lawrence's family. Photos. I haven't gone through all of it, but I'm like, wow, I didn't know, any of this. There's also an interview with Pam Grier. Just the documents and the fan mail. This is really, the ultimate edition. That's it. It's done. Hopefully people can see it and come by it, and I don't know if you are getting some feedback from readers right now. Are you getting, or comic fans?
Oh yeah. I've been online specifically, especially on Facebook and Instagram. Fans of the strip, and people who didn't even know about it have fallen in love with the book. I'm not just saying that because I created it. I've gotten the feedback across the board has been positive, thank God. People who are fans are like, man, you did a great job. And that was always my intention, Alberto, was to do what I was calling a 360-degree look at the character. My feeling was that anywhere Friday Foster has been created or recreated in the media, I wanted to talk about it. So we have the movie. There was a comic book, actually. There was a Friday Foster comic book company called Dell who did one. They did one issue, one-off of Friday Foster. That's another one that's very difficult to find. Jordi Longaron did not illustrate it, but again, there's a Friday Foster comic book that's pretty cool. There's a soundtrack that was released for the movie. So I talk about the soundtrack, the comic book, the movie. Anywhere she appeared in media, I wanted to include that in the book, and which we got. I was very, very fortunate, to be able to find all these things and include them in the book. So fans across the board have been like, hey man, great job on, comprehensive coverage. The only knock is that, some people are like, well, I wish you had done the daily. So like, well, that was kind of going to be way too much work to include all the daily strips as well. But
I cannot even imagine. That's so much, so many years of daily materials. So thank you so much, Christopher, for this great conversation and all this information that I didn't know, and all your passion for this project that has paid off so well. I hope this book has a long life, and people get to appreciate it and they can find it. I think it's quite easy to find a Barnes and Noble. I mean, the big bookstores, they all carry it, right?
Yeah, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, and even local comic book stores. Typically, you'll probably, if it's a comic book store, if you're a comic fan out there, you probably have to ask your comic store to carry it, but they will order it. I've come across that on a couple of occasions. And again, I have to say thanks to you, Alberto, because he's been kind of quiet about this, but he actually has an essay in the book where he talks about the cultural connection of Friday Foster to Spain. So again, thank you for your contribution. I absolutely appreciate it. I want, again, looking at Friday Foster from a 360-degree view, I wanted to have that academic approach to the character as well. So I thank you very much.
My pleasure. I was so happy, like, it made me more excited than, one articles you play in a journal, those boring things. Like, this is exciting. Come on, people are going to read it. This is, I'm part of this project. This is very exciting. So this is also to tell students that because there are many opportunities to do undergrad research at UMKC, and it can be materials like this, it can be comic strips, it can be, graphic novels, because these are part of the things that we use in our classes now. Like in several of my classes, I've used comics, and usually I'm more excited than the students, usually, they see it as homework, but, like, come on, this is more, this is not just a novel. This is something very exciting. But so yeah, this is something that can be studied and published on. And so keep that in mind. Thank you so much, Christopher. I'm going to share also the QR code for those students who need to scan it to get credit for first semester experience. So stick around just a couple of minutes when I share the screen. And thank you again, Christopher. And hopefully this is not the end for Friday Foster. There's something else coming up, right? Or eventually, or who knows?
I'm working on it. What I want to do is I want to do a Friday Foster animated series, a cartoon. Again, it's no guarantees at this point. It's going to be a long process, but I'm working that out right now. I'm waiting to hear from a few companies to see if we can put together a deal to get Friday Foster the animated show in action. So we'll see.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, guys. I appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.